Coming up next, the Bookening discusses how to read. Hello, my name is Jake. Today I'll be your humble and obedient host. Right there across from me, I've got the scholar who's a baller of reading. Brandon, how you doing, Brandon?
Hey, I'm doing great. Jake.
Jake, that's right, yeah. Jake, I am today the humble and obedient host. Right there on the other side of me is an empty chair. Why? Why do you ask?
Why? Yeah, why?
Why don't you ask why?
Why?
Because
Jake?
We're discussing how to read.
Oh, yeah. So the people who know how to read are in the room.
That's right.
People who don't
know how to read are not in the room. We know how to read. We may not know how to host a podcast, but
we don't. Probably not. I think you're doing fine, though.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm doing my best.
So we might be able to do this without him, just in general.
Yeah, we probably could. I could probably figure this out.
I think we'd be fine.
Yeah, it'd be all right.
We just gotta make him feel good, right? We invite him back each, and we tell him.
We have to pretend like we'd be no good at it, doing anything like this. But really, I mean, what does he do? He just is like, hey!
Yeah, I mean, anybody can do that. We could ask Barney the purple
Let me
dinosaur.
say something ridiculous right now. It'll be hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Brandon, true or false?
Yes.
You like to toss around the old pigskin.
Oh, I love to toss around the old pigskin. True.
So what you do is you get a pig, you slaughter it.
Yeah.
And you take the skin, you wad it up, and you throw it around.
Yeah, just toss the pigskin.
You throw it around. You toss the old pigskin around.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody who preferred to toss around the old pigskin like that instead of read?
Oh man, what did I say? This is a throwback.
That's the very first. I think it's the very first episode.
I think it's the very first thing we ever said.
It was a really smooth icebreaker that our humble and obedient host came prepared with.
Yeah. He's got so many great things that he asks us. All those schmoop questions he continually asks.
Yeah.
It's not like anybody can just look those up on the internet.
Yeah, go to schmoop.com right now and find an article on how to read, or we'll get rolling.
Then he pretends to hate Agatha Christie, but we all know that he actually has a secret Agatha Christie stash at his house.
You bet he does. He's got Agatha Christie posters. That's what I thought you were going to allude to.
Yeah, I didn't really want to tell people about that. The Agatha Christie shrine.
As soon as you open the front door.
He dresses like Poirot.
He does. He's got a little fake mustache that he glues on. He can't really grow a mustache himself.
Oh, yeah, he has to grow it. It looks fine. Sometimes it falls off a little bit, but we just pretend not to notice it.
Yeah.
So, I wonder how long it'll take for that for his caravan to get here.
No idea.
Bring him from the institution.
Sometimes the handlers have a little trouble getting him out of that little white suit they put him in.
Yeah, we're really the only ones who can be safe not having that on around. What else can we say about old Nathan? He's always on time.
Always on time.
Never late.
Never late. Never leaving us here.
I'm sure people really...
It's a lot harder than it looks filling up dead space.
It is. You think anybody's noticed that Nathan's not here?
Do you think anybody listens to this show because of Nathan?
No, I bet you anything. Our listenership spikes by like 200% next week.
Yeah, all we have to do is say no Nathan this go around.
Yeah.
Everybody like, oh yes, finally they got rid of that jerk.
Just us.
If only every episode where Jake and Brandon just talking about how irritating Nathan is.
I bet we'd have a lot of subscribers to that.
Yeah, a whole show centered around the fact that...
The Nathaning.
Yes, we call it the Nathaning. Or the unnathaning.
The unnathaning, yeah.
The unnathaning of the Bookening.
The longer he stays out of here, just the better this is going to get.
Yeah, this is going to get better and better.
He loves to wear blue shirts.
He does. He wears blue shirts quite a bit. He likes to talk about the shirts, too. He's over there. He's wearing the blue shirt. He's wearing the khaki pants. He's wearing the
tennis shoes.
Yeah.
Is that what he wears?
He wears that mix of shoe that's like between a tennis shoe and a dress shoe.
That black thing that he wears.
Yeah, it's a street shoe of sorts that's like
It's a comfort shoe.
Yeah, it tries to live in that dress casual space that's neither dress nor casual.
Because everybody knows that black shoes are what you wear with khaki pants.
They may be a dark brown.
They might be. Yeah. What else can we
Brandon's
say?
over there. He's wearing the black Henley. Yesterday he was wearing a white Henley.
Yeah, I like to wear my Henleys.
His white Henley was yesterday unbuttoned like one button, and Nathan made a awkward comment about his chest.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's unbuttoned 2 buttons, and so today he's got it down to just 1 button unbuttoned.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, hey, looky there.
Hey.
Are we going?
Oh, yeah, we're
Yeah, we've
talking.
been going for a long time.
That took a lot longer than you said it would.
Hey, fellas.
Hey, Nathan.
Hey.
Hey, listener.
Hey.
Will somebody catch me up? What are we doing?
Hey,
Well, we were talking about how to read a book.
Yeah.
Did you guys introduce yourselves?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was the humble and obedient host, and
Oh,
Yeah.
Brandon's
that's
the
not good.
scholar is a baller of reading.
okay. So you introduced yourselves. I'm glad.
Yeah?
Did
No?
you? Did you have some chatter? Some?
Oh, yeah, we had
Got
some
some chatter.
some
in, yeah.
banter.
Yeah, some
Chatter
banter.
and banter is basically all that we got in.
The requisite back and forth that people come to the
The
Bookening.
rock on tour.
The rock on. Yeah, that's a word. That's a random word. Okay, and then did you move? So you guys hadn't discussed how to read a book yet?
No.
No, you're just in time for that.
Okay, great. Well, what were you discussing when I walked in?
How awesome you are and how much we love you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well,
You'll hear it.
I love you guys both. I think you're great.
You know, you might maybe. Yeah.
I was just thinking on my way over. They're 2 loyal, wonderful friends. I sure am glad that I have them.
Hey, Nathan.
Yes,
How
Brandon.
about you let me edit this episode this time?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
So I didn't want to interrupt. Are you guys in the middle of something that we need to close
No.
this loop?
No, I think we closed it.
No, we're
I think we're good.
All right.
You're entering and closed it for us
All right. Well, how do you read a book?
with my eyes.
This is last week. Did you guys talk about what we did last week?
No, we
Did you guys do anything to actually establish this episode as an episode?
Jake introduced it as this week, the Bookening discusses how to read.
Did you do one of those like coming up next
Yeah.
kind of things?
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, he did.
Did Jake do his impression of me?
no.
No.
Did anyone do any kind of an impression of anyone?
No.
No.
Okay.
No.
Did you guys discuss my absence
No.
I only with longing sadness.
with longing sadness? Okay. We still have a full Bookening's worth of actual content that we need to that needs to happen though.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Okay. So
And maybe some banter. Maybe the banter wasn't that great after all.
it's whatever it is.
It's going in.
It's going in.
All right.
I'm looking forward to it. How to read a book. So last week we discussed the philosophy of how to read a book, if I'm remembering correctly. And this week we were going to discuss the mechanics of how to read a book. Like, how do you actually do it?
Yeah, sound out the words.
You get a book, you have it in front of you, you crack that thing, you open it up. What do?
You go to preschool,
Yep.
then you go to kindergarten.
Get hooked on phonics.
Yep. Then you go to
Hooked on
elementary
phonics worked
school.
For me, actually, it didn't. I never tried it.
Jake never got hooked on phonics.
My brothers did.
I think I was hooked on phonics. I don't know. Were you hooked on phonics, Brandon?
I mean, we did phonics in school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I was hooked on them.
What about cocaine?
Yeah, when I got to high school, I was hooked on other things.
Okay. We did cocaine. I don't know if I was hooked on it. I don't remember. Okay, so how do you read a book? Serious question. I mean, what are the tips and tricks of the trade? Do you guys? I can ask more. I have some more specific questions I will ask. Maybe I need to get us started, but I'm interested to just open it up to the floor.
I think it depends on the book.
Yep.
I approach different books differently.
Well, let's categorize them.
goal,
Let's
so-
come up with what are the different kinds of books you might find yourself reading, Jake,
Well, for me, it's fiction for this show. It's theology
as a pastor.
as a pastor. It's
And-
commentaries. It's maybe some biography, maybe some...
So taking out commentaries, because those are more taking out reference books of whatever stripe, I guess. Perhaps,
Excuse me, sure.
Unless you don't want to, because you have something valuable to say about how to read a reference book. But could we divide it up into serious nonfiction and fiction?
Yeah.
Do we need more than 2 categories, or
Not really for me. I mean,
Yeah, not for me either. I don't think.
there is a sort of third category, which would be like the occasional book that we've read for, say, Sound of Sanity, like the
12 Rules for
non-fictional
Life,
self-help. Yeah, the 12 Rules for Life or something like that. Or a self-helpy type book in that vein.
But you could almost say there's books that you read for improvement and books that you read for pleasure.
Yes.
Yes.
And the books on the Bookening would a lot of times be both, like Ready Player One improved Brandon's
Yes. Life and
life and
just in general.
ability to throw books across the room
Yeah, I
and
got
have
a
them
good throwing arm after
fall
reading
into
that.
trash cans. So we'll go ahead and talk about both. So Jake, you're saying you have different ways of approaching. How do you read a book for profit? not for money, but for improvement.
If it's theology, I read it. Generally, for improvement, I read it with a pencil in my hand.
A pencil instead of a pen?
Yes, always a pencil instead of a pen.
Because
I might need to erase. I might need to go back and change. My thoughts on a book aren't something that I think should be set in stone, actually. I think I should be able to come back to a book and, having matured, look at it a different way and erase or whatever, change, modify.
See, I hate myself,
look at it.
And I feel like I should be punished, and my immaturity should be set in stone, and so I use a pen.
Yeah. Well,
actually, that was the sarcastic way of saying a true thing, which is I both hate and like seeing the way that I was processing a book earlier.
Yeah,
it makes me feel good a lot of times to look through an old like theology tome or something and be like, oh man, that was a sticking point for me, or I couldn't understand this, and for it to just.
And to, there's merit but doing pencil gives you the option,
right,
of keeping that and commenting on it at a later date or whatever, versus just having it be there and in the way and stupid,
Yeah, I agree. I think probably I still prefer to use pen because I just don't like pencils. I've never liked the way pencils feel. Mechanical pencils are much less annoying to use, but they're also just like, I hate the feeling of a mechanical pencil more than anything in life. Like, mechanical pencils are really annoying.
Yeah, I use a mechanical drafting pencil.
That's probably the best thing that you could use. Yeah. Like some dumb high school plastic mechanical pencil. I would hate that. And number 2 just gets dull too quickly.
Yeah.
Brandon, your
mechanical
thoughts?
Pencils are a little dicey because
they snap.
It's not just that, they can scar the paper.
Right.
Because they can be so sharp. So you need something that's a little bit wider and heftier, and you can have a little rounded out so that it's not scarring the paper.
My thoughts?
Your thoughts?
When I take notes, I would use a pen, but I see the virtue of using a pencil, and I often used a mechanical pencil. Another strategy I've heard people use is they'll copy the book so that they have a version they can actually write on.
So that's something I learned from Tim Bailey. I only apply it to commentaries.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So the commentary is something that stays virgin. And then I mark up, I'll copy, the section out of the commentary, mark the crap out of it. And when I'm done, I'll throw it away. All of the thoughts that are useful that made it into the sermon will be in the sermon there.
Right. Yeah. And I'll have a record of that.
And I'll have a record of that. And I don't need that. When I come back if I were to come back to that passage, I'd copy it afresh, and just let whatever was striking me at the time as I'm processing the passage and the needs of our church, the needs of our people. I'll let it hit me fresh, and then I'll have, the record of the previous sermon to go back to. And that keeps it from getting cluttered and allows me to come back. And that's with my own commentaries. But, part of why we do that too is we share a lot of commentaries.
So you're not just going to mark up the Clear Note Church volume of such and such a...
Right, or mark it up in such a way that somebody coming to borrow what commentary I happen to have is going to have to deal with all of my underlines and notes and comments.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So if you're the type of person who's trying to actually build a library, who then is a valuable library that you want to then maybe give to your kids or whatever, whatever reason you have a library.
Right.
Then you have to think through, well, do I want them to have my notes? Do you think the people who are going to take the books from me, are they going to enjoy having my notes in the book?
Yeah.
Are they going to want it to be fresh? One of my favorite things, and I can never find this quote, but a professor once told this story that everybody who ever loaned a book to Coleridge said that you would get the book back improved because he would have all these notes in the margins.
Yeah.
And it was just fun to get his marginal notes. And so then I think that there's value to taking notes and notes that aren't going to disappear. To be honest, I think it's really preference. Are you the type of person who wants to be able to correct what you put in there? Then use a pencil. If you don't, if you just are fine with the mess, then use a pen.
Yeah, it really depends for me on the book. Like right now, I have a copy of Thomas Watson's Body of Divinity that I happen to be reading, and I mark the crap out of that in pen. But it's like a $7 copy. I almost figure when I'm done with this one, I'll probably buy another one. And maybe I'll even keep this one, and it'll just be the record of how I happen to hit this particular book
at this particular time.
But it might actually be nice to have a virgin copy to use for reference in general. But it's one of those books where you want to underline every single thing. Generally speaking,
that is a problem with Watson and Calvin.
Yeah, those would be the two that I actually had in my mind.
That if you're reading with a pencil in your hand and you think you're going to underline, you have to come in being very careful, or you're going to end up underlining the whole stinking thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really annoying, actually. With Watson, it's just like, I want to underline everything, but it's not doing me any good.
Yeah, that's not helpful. It's counterproductive.
Which is why I've actually forced myself to start writing my reactions to things so that I can actually track what it was that I thought was so dang important about this underline, since every other sentence is underlined anyway.
Yeah, which is a good thing to bring up because people probably want to know what sort of notes do you take in the margins.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple things. One, I'll write my reactions like, here's just my thought I had on this. Another might be if you're actually engaging with the book. So a lot of philosophy and stuff that I had to read, I would have like little marks. I would have a question mark I would draw if I disagreed with something.
Mm-hmm.
Or just if I especially thought a quote was just powerful or something I wanted to come back to, I'd do an asterisk beside it. So I had a series of symbols I would use, but then I'd also try to write the questions I might have.
Right.
Or the disagreements I would have. Another professor, when I was an undergrad, he would have us, after every 2 pages in a history text, he would have us write a 1-sentence summary of what we had just read, which was just a good practice for someone who's trying to learn how to retain what you've read.
Yeah.
And he would say you need to try and do it without going back and looking at the text again. Just try to remember when you get down to that page. Okay, here's a summary of what I just read. And so that might be another thing you could do in your book to just help you exercise retention.
Well, the thing about retention that I've learned in my many years, bitter years upon this spinning globe, is that a lot of times we don't retain because we don't learn in the first place. And so if I simply take a moment when I'm reading something to say, retain that, or take note of the fact, it's like when you're learning someone's name. The reason I don't remember people's names is because I'm in the middle of a conversation or I'm at church and I'm introduced. I really actually don't. It's not because I don't remember the name. It's because I never took a moment to plant the name in my brain in the first place.
Yeah.
It literally never entered my consciousness. So if I would just like take a moment to be like, this person's name is Paul, I'll remember it. It doesn't take any greater trick than that. And it's the same thing with books a lot of times. If I stop every 2 pages, for example, and say, in this history, the King of France did such and such. Well, there you go. I've got it.
Yeah.
I took a little mental snapshot. But if I just keep plowing through without actually making a note that that's what I wanted to grasp, then I mean, that's a very simple thing to say, but it's a very simple thing that I didn't do for a large portion of my high school education, certainly.
Yeah, I remember when your mind is young and sticky, and you can remember everything.
Oh, for those days.
Yeah, like you read a book and you remember, what page a line occurred on, and you can flip right to it. You can imagine it. You can visualize it. It's photographic. You remember all the details, all that stuff. I lived in denial for too long about being past those days. There are 2 kinds of notes that I make in books in serious nonfiction, and one's just sort of like structural notes, like, in this chapter, I will discuss 3 things. I'll mark that.
Underline each of the 3.
And then mark each of the 3 and put a little big, 1 with the circle, 2 with the thing, 3 with the thing. And then,
I do that with Watson a lot because he's like, here are the 9 reasons why we should glorify God.
Well, and especially with the Puritan, because he's going to go on for 100 pages.
And it's going to be the giant block of text. So if you simply, it's like you're adding, what's the word? You're adding formatting almost.
Exactly.
That just helps you visualize it.
Yeah, it's like pulling out, and it's like, now you can step back and my notes function as an outline. And then and then it's filled in, because that's the way they're so linear often in the way that they process these things. But you can get lost in the minutia. They're never lost in where they're at in the flow of their argument. But it's easy for you to get lost.
Yeah, if I'm not being careful, he'll be like, and point number 2, and I'll be like, point
what?
number 2, what was number 1? And then I'll scroll back like 10 pages and
and so just having that and just understanding where you're at in the argument and where different points fit into the argument helps you understand then conceptually and just sort of grasp where you're at conceptually. So that's like one kind of marking that I'm doing in a text like that. And then the other kind is just like my, this is really good, or remember this, or what is he talking about? And, I'll write the questions, or I'll have the arguments. I'll try to flesh it out. And that's something, these are things that I learned straight from Adler. Argue with him. He calls it structural and conceptual note taking, and doing both. Both making sure you grasp the big picture and that your notes reflect that, but then also just being willing to engage with the author and argue with them as you go.
Yeah,
ask the questions, think it out, write your thoughts, write what you're thinking.
Well, and I'll find if I make an application, for example, or if I sometimes if I rephrase something or put my own metaphor in there, those will be the things I'll remember the most, actually. It's almost, I mean, I don't want to get too relativistic or too weird about it, but what you retain or what I retain from a book is it's almost like my brain writes its own book based on that book. And it just makes its own. And the books that I really remember. It takes on a
life of its own.
Yeah, I write sort of my own thing. I don't know how to explain this, but.
Well, what happens often is an author will say something, he'll make a point. It'll trigger a thought in your mind. It'll come to mean something to you and it'll apply in a particular way. You'll have to reformulate it for yourself. And then you'll forever in your mind think this time that Chesterton said that, or this time that whoever said this.
Calvin, it can actually be disappointing to go back because it's like
he never actually said that.
No, he said the thing that triggered me saying that.
Yeah, but that's what you remember. And maybe it was all there. The point isn't he said it. Yeah. The point is that's where you learned it.
Yeah, you've got a famous one of those that you always bring up. I forget what it is, but there's some point that you always make on the Bookening. You've said several times where you're like, I'm not sure whether this is the guy or this is me.
Yeah, Walter Benjamin. His book on translation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or his essay on translation. And I know that what I feel like I got from that essay has been very influential for me.
Yeah.
And
what's even things like a really famous one's the Neil Gaiman quote, right?
That everyone just assumes is the Chesterton quote.
Yeah, and that we have, I think at one point thought said on this show was a Chesterton quote before we got to the bottom of it.
Right. Yeah, no, we definitely did. I did, I think.
Yeah.
So
we don't tell children fairy tales to teach them that dragons don't exist.
That teach them dragons are real, but that dragons can be defeated or something like that.
Yeah, it's that whole people.
And it's attributed to Chesterton. It's because that's his very succinct takeaway from something random that Chesterton said that triggered that for him.
Yeah. Right.
He would be wrong to say he didn't get it from Chesterton. He says he got it from Chesterton, but also it's not a Chesterton quote.
It's one of your metaphors. It was inspired by Chesterton, like you were saying. And so
Chesterton says that all over the place without actually saying it that way.
Right. And he even says that he uses that metaphor. It's just like this big, long Chestertonian circumlocution, and Gaiman made it into 2 sentences so that it could live on the internet forever after.
Yep.
Yeah. And so what Jake was saying about structure versus concept, that sort of note taking. So for anyone who has to talk about a book you're taking notes on, what I found helpful in grad school and in undergrad was learning the difference between a book that you really want to read to retain every word versus a book that you're just having to read it because you have to talk about this book. And so then the sort of thing you're looking for are the talking points, the things you disagree with. You also want to be able to, you want to get the structure down. You want to know the general argument that's happening.
Well, and
then also you want to read for the concepts that you want to bring up in class or whatever, because you want to have a general grasp of what's happening.
Right. Not every book is worthy of all of your time and attention.
And that's what I was about to say.
There are many, many books that are only worthy of a skim, and they may have good ideas or concepts in them, but skimming, reading the first and last lines of paragraphs, opening paragraphs and closing paragraphs of chapters, getting gists is perfectly acceptable depending on the book you're reading and the goal of reading it in the first place.
Yep. That's exactly where I was headed.
Good. Yeah.
And there are lots of books like that in school that you have to just be willing to.
People get tripped up thinking that that's something you shouldn't do.
That it's cheating or something like that.
But I guarantee you the best students are always the ones who realize.
They're making value judgments about their time, about this book, about what it has to offer. And it's not a proud thing to do that. It can be. It can be a proud thing to do that. But often it's like, you've got to weigh out the pros and cons. And often, if you're in school, your professors will be honest with you about that sort of thing too. And they'll say...
The good ones will.
Yeah, the good ones will. They'll be like...
The worst teachers are the officious, pedantic teachers that...
You need to read every word of every line.
Because there's some magical karma in reading every word of every line.
That's not the point.
Yeah.
That's not the point. And if you think that's the point, you're wrong. And that's true of every book.
Yeah, I think that's true of fiction. I've said it before. I skim or skip Russian politics in Tolstoy because I don't care about Russia. I don't live in Russia.
You don't care about Tolstoy?
I don't care about Tolstoy, actually. I mean, that's true. What Tolstoy wanted and what I want are different, actually, when I'm reading Anna Karenina. A little bit. We diverge on one point, which is that he thinks I need to know about Russian politics, and I think I do not.
And you don't.
And I don't.
Perfectly fine. And people need to realize that that's okay.
Yeah.
And you're going to run into it
listen,
even more.
I am probably, I'm the one who made the point, and I am probably the one who has the most internal hangups about that exact thing
Yeah.
in this room.
Yeah, I can't.
I couldn't not, I had a hard time allowing myself to skim Russian politics in Tolstoy, for instance.
I had
Depends
hangups
on
about
the book.
that until
Yeah.
I had a good professor in grad school, actually. I was having trouble getting my reading done, and he's like, well, your problem is you read every word. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like,
Isn't that the point?
yeah, he's like, no. He's like, you read, he said, what you should do is your love of books should be spent on the good things.
Yep.
And the novels that you want to read, great. Read every word of them, devour them. But he said, these essays that I give you guys as secondary reading, he said, read the first sentences of the paragraphs, get the gist of what's happening. And then once I realized that's okay, I started having better things to say in class because I'd actually get the readings done.
You get the readings done, and you would actually be a more efficient reader. You would actually, because you're scanning so much.
Yeah.
Because you're just there for the points, the main points, not to be carried along by some essay that's dry and boring and stupid that you're going to get lost in.
Yeah.
You actually get what he's trying to say better than somebody who immerses himself in it.
Yeah.
And so it was actually the second step of what
Come away with actual articulate thoughts about it.
The second step of what I would actually naturally do with generally essays or difficult arguments is I would do a first reading, and then you'd have to go back and like start piecing it together. And I do this still with a lot of essays that are hard to understand, and you get a general gist of what you think it's about, and that's the first. And now I realize that's fine to just have that be a skim.
Well, I
think.
And then you can go back and you can say, okay, so here's the first sentence of this paragraph, here's the next, and you can start generally structuring and putting the bones together. Actually, that's a good way you can find out whether or not someone's worth reading anyways.
Right.
Because if the bones are there, you should be able to find them. And if not, then all you have is a pile of fat.
Right. Well, let me say something controversial. I do that with fiction, actually. I do that with every book that we read on the Bookening because I find that narrative lust, if I can call it that, is so great within me that I sort of have to slake that first. Like, I've got to find out what's going to happen to poor Anna and Levin and everything. Yeah. And then, this is why I actually don't take notes when we read a novel. Sometimes I will take a picture with my phone of something that I want to go back to and explore deeper. But generally speaking, I want to find out whether Lizzie ends up with Darcy. And so I'm going to power through that thing.
Yep.
And, sometimes even get a little skimmy. I hate to admit it, but especially with classic books where I know that there's a lot of, again, this might sound like sacrilege to people, but where I know there's a lot of free resources online to help me zero in on the things that I'm interested in.
You don't close read everything.
No. I book in. That's what I do.
And here's the truth. Anyone who tells you that they close read everything, they don't close read everything.
Adler basically prescribes what you're talking about. He says the very first thing that you should do is he calls it inspectional reading. He says you should skim it all. You should get in your mind a picture of the whole.
Right.
Yeah. You should figure out the outline, the structure, where he's going, what he's trying to do, why. Figure out even what's important and what's not. Assess the value of going deep or not going deep in the book. Yeah. I'm just looking at the table of contents, remembering this because it's been like 10 or 11, 12 years since I've read it. But that's the very beginning for him is like you go to the table of contents, you figure out the structure, you skim, you look ahead, and you do that with everything so that you can actually be prepared to read the book then when you come to the book.
And I think I've said
and to value it, give it the value that it deserves.
Right. You get done kind of skimming your way through Ready Player One. It's like, well, that was all that deserved.
And then he's, the next step after that, which he calls just the analytical reading, the very first thing he wants you to do is to pigeonhole the book, to generalize, to classify it, and to decide what you're going to learn from this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which all this really means is just to be engaged with what you're reading. I think a lot of people, and we've talked about this before, they approach a book as though they're just going to absorb the book by staring at the page.
Yeah.
Or just by trying to power through and not actually engage it. And all engagement means is paying attention to what the author's saying.
Right.
Yep.
And if a part's dry, you can skim over it. That's fine. If it's not doing it for you, there's probably a reason it's not doing it for you. Some of it might be that you have to learn how. I mean, a lot of students when they first... So the big
Some of it might be you're lazy.
Yeah, the big caveat and the big exception to everything we're saying is when you read poetry.
Mm-hmm.
Because poetry is such a different animal. Poetry demands that you pay attention to every word because you're paying attention to rhythm, you're paying attention to syntax, you're paying attention to metaphor.
That'd be like listening to music fast forwarded.
Yeah, poetry is very different. And that's why a lot of people don't have patience for poetry.
Right.
But poetry does work at a different level. It's a different frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't skim poetry. You can try, but it's not going to be the same.
But here's the thing, then the necessary qualification for any of these other books is that you had better in your skimming and in your judgments about what's worth your time and what's not worth your time, you'd better make sure you actually know what the author is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You'd better not be dismissive of something until you know what it is you're being dismissive of.
Well, and the sad thing about that is, I don't know if it's sad or not actually, but you really have to give yourself to primary sources for that. I mean, in other words, you really have to actually read the text of the book because you just can't rely on reviews anymore or professors. I don't know if you ever could, but you certainly now, if you read scholarship on Jane Austen, as we've discussed many times, it will tell her how
much
she is a socialist, proto-feminist, blah, 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 blah. And she's just simply not. If you read scholarship on Calvin, same kinds of things.
All kinds of garbage out there in Calvin scholarship.
Yeah. I mean, the flip side also is that just because someone is loved by the left or loved by progressive movements, one of the big examples would be, for a long time, I would not read E.E. Cummings because he was so different.
Right.
But then when I actually sat down and read E.E. Cummings' poetry, he's delightful.
Yeah.
He's amazing. So, meaning that, like you're saying, I actually sat down with E.E. Cummings and read E.E. Cummings instead of what I just thought this straw man E.E. Cummings was in my head.
Death, I think, is no parentheses.
Yeah, man. So good.
And he didn't even want his name to be spelled in that with all lowercase letters.
Yeah, we just did it to him.
Yeah, I think to what Jake was saying, I always ask what I want to get out of a book, and I'm not ashamed to ask. I mean, even with something like, I think there's a way of doing that with humility. You know, there's a way of saying, Thomas Watson, for example, to take an extreme example, he probably knows better than me what I need.
Right.
But also, maybe it's just I'm a lazy guy. I'm not motivated unless there's something in it for me. I'm a pragmatist. I always have been. It's one of the reasons I did poorly in school, frankly speaking. I have to know why I'm reading something. I have to know, like, if I'm reading a novel, am I reading this for pleasure? Am I reading this for edification? Am I reading it for both? If I'm reading Thomas Watson, if I'm just thinking...
Well, listen, it's part of the burden of the author to convince you that there's a why.
Right.
Right? You need to know what he's saying. You need to know why he's saying it. You need to know why you should care about it.
Right.
Like,
but even reading someone as great as John Calvin, if I can think, well, on this particular read through, it's because I want to be able to discuss it for this club. Or on this particular read through, it's because I need to shore up my theology for such a,
I need to get a better understanding of church and civil government, so I'm rereading parts or all of book 4 of the Institutes.
I think having those kinds of things in mind as mental hooks so that certain things will jump out at you and become more concrete is actually helpful, even when approaching a sheer genius, even when approaching someone who knows more about what you need than
you do.
You do. It's still sort of just having a purpose is going to just help you.
Well, and that's why you should read broadly too. You know, it's why you can pigeonhole a book, but you shouldn't pigeonhole yourself.
Right.
You should be reading broadly across genres, across disciplines, and not just be shaped like, the dumb homeschooler who just is allowed to read only the things that he likes. Right? He needs to be disciplined and pushed beyond just his appetites.
Yeah, just because, for example.
And you need to be pushing yourself too beyond just your appetites. And you can come to a place in your life where you're 35 years old and you've got a job and you've got goals and you've got things to do, and you don't necessarily need to spend your time reading a science textbook.
Sure.
Because, for whatever reason, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that broad exposure, knowing what you're after, and part of what you're after being to grow in your knowledge of God and of the world He's made and of the people in it.
Yeah, well, speaking more specifically about fiction and the kinds of books that we read on the Bookening, because we've been talking broadly and sort of emphasizing the nonfiction aspect of things. How do you guys, let's just say, what did we just read? We just read Persuasion. No, we're about to talk about Persuasion on the Bookening.
We just read
Gatsby. How do you guys approach a book like that specifically?
Well, I think Gatsby's a good example because Gatsby is very literary.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything that you might have ratcheted up to 11 or whatever,
Right.
that you might expect to run into with other novels. It's got a decent story, a plot, but it's got a lot of beautiful prose too.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I have an author like that, I try to give them the benefit of reading the beautiful parts slowly and maybe even rereading the beautiful parts. So like even with Joyce, the dad has some gorgeous writing.
Well, yeah, and if you're going to criticize Joyce, you should read him properly.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're going to throw him across the room, at least read him properly until you get to the point where you're going to throw him across the room.
And so all that to say, when you get to writing that's meant to be read slowly, I try to read it slowly and take it in and enjoy what the author's doing. But I can't do that with every single sentence. And so a writer that tries to do that with every single sentence, such as maybe Hemingway, can kind of get exhausting.
Right.
Well, our goals with the fiction that we read anymore, since we read it for this show, are divided.
Yeah.
Right? We're not reading it simply for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We're not reading it simply to enjoy it on its own terms or anything like that. We're reading it for that, while also reading it with the deadline and with the goal to be able to discuss it in a helpful way for other people.
Right.
And that changes the way that you can read.
Yeah, no, it does. So
books.
People shouldn't imagine me sitting in some quiet reading study, enjoying every single word and
Your jacket with patches.
I think it's
that's
certainly
wonderful.
impacted our takes on books.
Oh yeah, there's things that I would have enjoyed more if we
you
had
had the luxury to take the
been
time.
able to luxuriate in it. I think actually last year Dickens was the perfect example of something that, obviously we all three had some different takes on Dickens. Don't have to get into that, but as we said in the Dickens episodes, imagine getting a little chunk of that every month and reading it. It would read so differently than trying to power through it for a freaking podcast.
Yeah, that was, I think, the main difficulty that I had with it.
Yeah, I'm willing to cut Jake a ton of slack for not liking Dickens.
For not being able to get to a 1,000-page novel.
Yeah, this 1,000-page discursive, there's a nice word, discursive tome.
Yeah, you're sitting there talking.
In a month during the holidays.
Right.
And with Dickens, we don't want to get into Dickens. I don't get the sense that Dickens just likes to hear himself talk.
Mm-hmm.
I get the sense that he just wants to tell you a story.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is it's like sitting and listening to your grandfather, who's really good at storytelling, tell you a story for 80 hours.
Right. Grandpa. And you really have to get the story read for told for a deadline.
So
maybe speed things up a little, Gramps.
A lot of little side trails, and with Dickens, it's hard to cut that out. Dickens is a particularly difficult guy to just read and skim and try for plot.
Well, I will say, Brandon, I have a difficult time slowing down. I really do. There's something about me that wants to admire the thing as a whole when I'm reading it. And even when there's an absolutely beautiful sentence or a really snappy line of dialogue or just something to really focus on, I don't like to have to stop during my first read through of anything. So I pretty much always, even when it's a book I've read before that we're going back to for the Bookening, I will barrel my way through it because that's just personally how I process things.
I do it the same way. I'll usually reach the end of a chapter and then I'll be like, well, I want to go back and read this part again.
Yeah.
That was amazing. Why did it move me the way it did? And
I will take little notes. Like usually I have my phone next to me and I will either snap a picture of a page when I see something I want to go back to, or I'll just throw something in iNotes, just like I'll dash something. And if I was, living in olden times, I suppose I'd have a notebook and a quill and I'd, make a little note of, or a pen, I guess, make a little note of what it is I want to go back to. But then I go back and sort of do all my processing in another pass because I want to find out whether Jim and Antonia are going to end up together. I don't want to stop. And so even if I already know, I want to get the broad sweep of it. Okay, I know
That's
they're going to
fair.
stake Dracula, but let's find out.
And I feel that instinct too, and I do something that drives my wife crazy, which is I'll often, through things like Spark Notes or Wikipedia, I will spoil the plot for myself just because I love seeing I love seeing the way an author tells a story.
Right.
And that is just because I'm really interested in that sort of thing.
I think I should have done that with Dickens.
Yeah, I like the mechanics and watching how they do it, and I like the sleight of hand. I like the way they build characters. I just like all the things that go into, and we can talk about how to pay attention to that sort of stuff. That might be helpful.
Right.
But,
So much for me with fiction. I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
no, I was just going to, so the final thing is I will often ruin the plot, so I don't get sucked into that because I remember the first time I read David Copperfield, I read it pretty much in a night because, you had to skim. The book is huge, but I just wanted to find out what's going to happen to David. This is amazing.
Right.
So
that's a fun enough experience when it's done well that I don't like to ruin it with spoilers.
yeah,
But I understand the instinct.
yeah.
when it comes to fiction for me, I like to come in blind, start on page 1, and just drive to the end.
Well, and something you've often talked about, I don't know if you've ever said it on Mike, Jake, but one thing that's kind of funny about you is you have a pretty good brain for plot mechanics. And so oftentimes if you're really enjoying a book, you'll be like, I don't want to talk about this. I'm not going to think about this. I don't want to see the machinery until I'm done. You'll be like annoyed with yourself sometimes because you'll figure something out, like what the twist is or how it's going to end. And then you'll be like, well, this is dumb.
Somehow or another, my brain got trained early on just in plot mechanics.
Hashtag goosebump.
Yeah, it was goosebumps. And half of the fun of reading a book for me was figuring out what's going to happen beforehand and seeing it coming, and then getting to a place where, I really just want to be carried along for this ride. And like actively working to not spoil things for myself by trying to be blind, trying to not think, not talk about things. Mm-hmm. But I sometimes I wonder if I shouldn't just go ahead and spoil it so that's not how I
join the dark side.
Yeah, I've done that's not how I'm engaging with it. I don't have to engage it that way.
Because I'll tell people, I guess I will tell people, I don't know why I started the sentence that way. Let me tell you, that's what I meant. I still think I get just as much enjoyment out of a good work of fiction knowing the plot beforehand as I would not knowing the plot beforehand. Mm-hmm. It's just a different sort of enjoyment, but I can still feel, if it's well done, I can still feel the intensity of the fact that Gatsby gets shot at the end.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But since I know it also, I can watch the way he's doing it, so then I send you, disappointed comments about it.
Right.
Because I see what's going on, and I get disappointed.
Well, that's one of the things that's always a part of reading maturely, part of engaging with any art maturely, is beginning to see craft.
Yeah.
And I think there is a stage that probably every person that actually becomes a student of the craft goes through, where everything becomes a little gray for them. Maybe this is just my personal experience, but there was a point in my life where I suddenly stopped enjoying movies precisely because I had learned to enjoy the craft so much that I suddenly couldn't see the forest for the trees for a while. It was worth pushing through that because then I got the forest back. And now I sort of just have two brains running at the same time. Anytime I'm watching a movie, I have a brain that's just appreciating the story. And then there's another brain that's like, oh, that's so cool how the music interacted with the shots, interacted with the thing. There's one brain that's going, oh, Daniel Plainview is really moving me right now. And then there's another brain that's going,
Daniel Day-Lewis.
Daniel Day-Lewis's acting is amazing. Yeah. And I've actually got both brains pretty developed because I'm a movie guy, right? Books probably a little bit harder for me to just switch between the two of them in some sense, maybe, perhaps. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just positing that.
But I think I can do it pretty easily. And, and so it's still a good experience, but I have learned not to post my comments about the ending of things in Slack because I don't want to spoil it for you.
Right.
Yeah. Well.
But if you want to be spoiled, hey.
Well,
we all know the famous story of me spoiling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the fact is, the way that it's a really interesting hand wrap you got going there.
Nice job, Hellboy.
I don't know. For me, it just feels like part of the fun is watching it unfold, figuring out where it's going, while deciding if she's doing a good job of...
The one time in my life where I've actually had to just read it because I didn't know what was going to happen and I couldn't figure it out was with the release of Deathly Hallows. Mm-hmm. Anna read it and then I read it the next night. We both read it really fast. And that was an interesting, it was... Or watching like the Infinity War.
Right.
You can't figure out what's going to happen if you're going and seeing it opening night with your son. You're just experiencing it with everyone else. And there is something, I understand the delight and pleasure of that.
Uh-huh.
Well, even
it's just not such an intense delight and pleasure for me personally that I don't also mind spoiling it for myself.
Well, I think there's been so many books. There's been so few books that have ever surprised me because I've always had a pretty innate sense of how story works. I mean, maybe that sounds smug, but it's just like I always, even if I don't read the spoilers, I always know how the book's going to end.
I can make it less smug sounding.
Yeah.
I think that authors who in particular are only about surprising you in a way that you could have never expected, they're always in the end disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Because you want a sense of inevitability to your story.
Right.
Like what's really great about Infinity War, just to have some pop culture references here,
right,
is the fact that once you go back and you see how it ended, it's like, That was the appropriate ending for this particular installment in the saga. Right? If you're going to have the big bad like this, you want him to win.
Right.
So
I don't know if I agree with that assessment of Infinity War, but that's another podcast. It's still a good example of what we're talking about.
It all depends on how they...
Yes.
The next installment, yes.
Yes.
I might not be saying that.
Audiobooks, yes or no?
Depends.
Yep.
It depends on what your goals are. You're not going to, unless you are a very audio-oriented learner, you're not going to retain as much. You're not going to be able to go back as easily. I mean, you can. There's like 15-second back or 30-second back. But, it's easy to get sort of lost in your thoughts about a book while the book continues to be read to you. But yeah, there's absolutely a time and place for audiobooks.
It's me copying to my own immaturity. But honestly, I can read a book and get lost in my thoughts. Like, I will literally find myself reading forward and not paying attention to what I'm reading at the same time. And I realize that sitting down with a book and making yourself look at it and hold it in your hands, it forces a kind of intimacy with the material that simply listening to it while doing something else never will. But
all of our listeners are doing that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I think
then again, we are just talking, and we didn't sit down and script this out and devote.
Right. But we do other podcasts where we do, and we expect.
But we also account for that by giving space to breathe and catch up and bits of humor and we work to bring the listener along and to make it okay for them to have spaced out for periods of time.
Sure. I think you just always have to know what you're doing, and there's no reason to be smug about any particular version of it as long as you're using the tool correctly. If you realize that you're looking through a somewhat murky telescope when you listen to an audiobook, that can be the most effective way to do your first pass of any book. And indeed, I do it with 90% of the Bookening books.
Yeah, I mean, just being a pragmatist here, if you're a busy person, that might be the only way you ever get to experience the story in the book.
Sure.
Right.
And if it's a book that, like a lot of what we read, why is it any different than having your mom or somebody read you a book when you're a kid, right? It's a similar experience. You still get the book.
Except instead you get a professional reader instead of your mom, which is better and worse.
Yeah, better and worse. And you still hear the story. Yeah, you don't have the freedom to pause it and go back and listen very easily, especially if you're like renting it through the library or something.
Right.
Hoopla. It's really hard to listen to an audiobook in Hoopla.
I'll have it preserved if you have it on CD or something silly like that.
I still borrow it a lot through Hoopla. I listen to a lot of the books. And then what I'll do is I'll go back and then find the sections I want to
look at
closely.
I will note even a phrase. And I really appreciate the fact that we live in the year 2019 and I can usually Google something if I don't have time to make a note of it, and I just hear, as long as I retain a phrase or two of it, I can find it. Even if it's a book that's not in public domain, I can usually find some reference, find my way back to it in the volume. If the internet is a bicycle for your mind, I'm not afraid to ride that bicycle as hard as I can to make my life easier. Enable me to do podcasts, enable me to get acquainted with material like The Great Gatsby as quickly as possible with as little pain and as little effort as possible.
For me, audiobooks are the books that I'm going to be most... I save the books that are throwaway books for audiobooks, which would be like, I will not listen to theology on audiobook.
No, that would be pointless. I will admit that.
And I, generally speaking, I don't listen to fiction on audiobooks because I just enjoy the pleasure of reading it and interpreting it myself and hearing it in my own head and bringing my own imagination to it. But if it's a book like a 12 Rules for Life or something like that,
you really just want the arguments. There's nothing that interesting about
give me the audio. Yeah, give me the audio book and I'll put it on 1.5 speed or 2 times. And the point is the 12 big ideas and a little bit of it that sticks. It's not the pleasure of reading it. It's not the prose. It's not the anything. It's the what's this about and why should I care? And those are the books that I'll do that on Audible or wherever else.
Yeah. A book that at the end of the day, you're going to merge probably with 2 touchstones from that you can use in conversation or teaching or whatever it is you're going to use them podcasting. And that's it.
Yeah.
You read 400 pages to get those 2 things out of it. And
it's like any Malcolm Gladwell book.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would I bother reading a Malcolm Gladwell book? I'll listen to it on Audible. Get it done way quicker. get the two touchstone things out of it that are interesting and insightful and helpful.
And you can hear
move on
him
with
read
my
it in
life.
his reedy, annoying Malcolm Gladwell voice.
I got to imagine, this can be off podcast if you want to. I got to imagine there are some theologians that's fine with as well. Like I can think like John Piper.
Sure,
Fairly
modern
fine
theologians.
audio, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, I wouldn't.
Yeah, but I don't read modern theologians, or I rarely, if ever, would. I mean,
I know what you were saying. Calvin, Luther, you don't want to read those guys.
no.
Well, if
you don't wanna
the point of reading
listen to
those
those
guys
guys.
was to just get one or two ideas, I wouldn't be opposed to it. Like on principle, I don't have a problem.
no, but that's
with it.
never why you take the time to read them.
You want
if
those
you-
little crystals of awesomeness that are going to stick forever, and the only way to
I
get
wonder
those.
how long it would take to get lost in the weeds with Calvin, trying to listen to him on audio.
It would be almost impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to be able to step back and visually see where you're at.
Yes.
Mhm.
And that's true of people like Calvin and people like Watson. I bet you could listen to Watson just fine, and be carried along, but at the same time, that's not how you want to take Watson.
Although fun counterpoint to that, those things like Body of Divinity, it's a collection of sermons.
Right.
So the original form that Watson intended them. I don't disagree with you at all. I just think it's funny to think that at some point people had to sit there for 3 hours or whatever it was and listen to those.
Yeah.
Like here are the 10 points of. Here's
And
the
be
10
carried
reasons
along
why God
and-
is glorified. Here's the 12 reasons
hashtag
how
Neil
you can
Postman
glorify.
about the way our minds have changed in
Yes.
terms of what we can understand and not understand. Having literary minds instead of,
Twitter minds.
Twitter minds.
yeah.
But you have to cop to your weaknesses, even your cultural weaknesses. I have no patience for people who want to pretend like their brain. I mean, you can read Amusing Yourselves to Death all you want and bemoan the state of the brain that you've been given that's influenced by using an iPad, and you can go live on a farm somewhere like Thanos, but then
Like
you're a big
Thanos
purple
or,
space monster.
Or what's his face?
Old MacDonald. Who else went and lived on a farm?
Yeah, that guy. Say it. What's his name?
Rambo? Does Rambo live on a farm in one of them?
No, that guy who like types on his typewriter and makes his wife
Oh, yeah, that guy. Wendellberry.
Oh,
Wendellberry. Yeah,
Yeah.
Wendellberry and Thanos.
I mean, the fact is, I have a computer, I have a phone, I have podcasts.
Is Wendellberry Thanos?
Yeah, I think Widowberry is Thanos. The whole thing's a metaphor. Any other tips for reading? Brandon?
No, I'm sure we have other tips. Oh, I'm sure people want to talk about when you read fiction, are you looking for, like, how are you analyzing it, right?
Yeah, I suppose we should talk about that.
Should we?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Oh, boy. So, what are you looking for when you read fiction? Should I answer this question? Get
I
us
think it
started?
can depend a lot, but yeah, why don't you start us out?
So the things that we've said earlier still apply. You skim it, you get the gist. You don't skim it. You get the gist of the story, and you want to know what the story is about, what the general plot. But then you can go back and start looking for specific things. And we have these categories to talk about literature for a reason. And you want to look for first plot. What is it about? Then character. What types of characters are there? When you're trying to look at these things, always look at relationships. Like, why does this character have this relationship to this character? How are they related to one another? How does the author use them? Probably one of the easiest examples we have in bookening history to understand this sort of literary analysis would be Levin versus Anna and Anna Karenina. A lot of people just think the book's about Anna Karenina and they miss the fact that Levin's there as well. So why is Levin there? Well, it's obviously as a foil to Anna so that you can get, and Anna as a foil to Levin so you can get other
Point and
meanings.
counterpoint.
Yeah, counterpoint.
Little Levin changes the whole loaf.
And you'll find out. Yeah. That's great, Nathan. It's actually a t-shirt. A little Levin changes the whole loaf.
With Levin's name?
Yeah.
You mean that is a t-shirt that exists? Or
No,
that's
it should be a t-shirt.
A little Levin's the whole.
Yeah.
little Levin's the...
Then have like a loaf of bread about to get run over by a train or something.
That sounds like a great t-shirt.
With the guy.
Yeah. And you want to look at these things and then ask yourself questions like, why is and Jane Austen's another great example of this. Like, why do you have Louisa Musgrove? We haven't talked about it yet, have we?
No, people will...
So why do you have her? And then you also have Anne Elliot.
Right.
Like, and how are they supposed to relate to one another? And good authors are always going to have intentionality behind the characters they put in their stories. The character's going to have lives of their own, but they're still going to have intentionality behind this character. Why is this character here? And so, like, that's one of the fun things with Shakespeare and, like, King Lear, trying to figure out why is the fool there?
Right.
And everybody's fooled as to why the fool's there because I don't think anybody actually knows.
Right.
So then you're looking for character. Then you're also looking for themes. And this is what some people would call the great conversation or the the transcendental themes.
Right.
I just like to call them themes.
We avoid using the word worldview, but this is where we almost say it when we talk about themes.
So I just prefer using the word themes. We don't have to talk about the great themes or the transcendental themes because they're transcendental because they deal with things that every human has happened to deal with, such as death and time and love and emotion. So you can get you can start categorizing your emotions too that get dealt with. But these things that
you can only understand on Walden Pond.
Yeah, that you can only understand on Walden Pond. Actually, that's not a bad exercise. Imagine to yourself what some navel-gazing narcissist who goes to live at Walden Pond would think that they would need to understand about the world. Make a list out for yourself there, and those are the themes you look for when you read a book. So, and we've talked about them on the Bookening quite a bit. One thing I appreciate about our approach is we don't just get hard-nosed about it unless we think that's the only thing to say about a book is what theme the author. And this is where a lot of people make mistakes is because then you start thinking, well, Charlotte's Web, for example, I think this is a good example, fine. E.B. White was, after he wrote the book, probably realized, this book has elements of time in it. Now, was he sitting there thinking, I'm going to make time the great theme of this book so that I can participate in the transcendental conversation about time? No, he just realized that time is one of the great themes of literature, and so he wrote about time because it helps these themes. When you put them in your books, lo and behold, they help make your book give some weight to it. So the mistake people make is then reading intentionality into the author that probably never was really there, which gets kind of funny. The people do it all the time with Shakespeare.
Right.
Like Shakespeare must have been participating in the great Renaissance conversation about time and about death and about and love and all these things. And you're just like, no. Yeah, understood the cultural.
Story.
This is, say what?
He was just kind of telling a good story, and it turns out good stories hit on kinds of themes that interest and affect everybody.
Well, he would have been thinking about it that way, which is just where people get really funny. It's like Shakespeare was just telling us this about time. And my favorite example is when people try to then read it back into the Greeks and the Romans with Homer. Like Homer was doing this, and he was like, you find themes of death and longing and all these themes that you see in literature in these great stories, because that's how you tell a great story, is by having these elements there. It doesn't mean they were sitting there thinking, I'm going to put an element of time in. And what are my contemporaries saying about time? If people read a lot of frustration that I get with certain approaches, that's I just think it's funny. And it's just not a helpful way of thinking about literature, because we might read those themes in and find the themes, and it's helpful to see these themes, but you're wrong if you think that's how a good author goes about creating a good story.
What's what George Lucas did? He
went and he found the great themes. And
I bet he didn't, though, actually. I mean, I think it makes a nice story that he read Joseph Campbell and then retro-engineered the greatest space opera, but he probably, he grew up with those old serials and he just wanted to tell a story about guys with laser swords. And sure, did he read Joseph Campbell? Yes. Did it influence his thinking? Yes. Did he mechanically engineer everything that's great about Star Wars? No, he didn't.
No, the guy who wrote Flash Gordon did.
Yeah.
Flash Gordon.
Yeah, but that guy never heard of Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. So you're looking for themes, and symbols. All a symbol is it's when you have, for example, the red handbag in Anna Karenina is a famous symbol. And people try to figure out, so what is the red handbag supposed to mean? She's always got this red handbag, especially on the train. And so a symbol is any object in the story. It's not a theme. Themes are different. Themes are things like time and death and longing, those sorts of themes that you would have. A symbol would actually be a physical thing within the story that you think the author is putting meaning into.
An object associated with the theme.
Yeah. And then, so what would be we just read a great example, the green light in Gatsby. That is a symbol. And for Gatsby, it's a symbol. And then what's fascinating with a good symbol, like Snow in The Dead, is by Joyce, is you watch how the symbol shifts and takes on new meaning and changes meaning throughout the story. And that's all it is. It's a way for the author to both provide a backbone to the story. The green light, it provides a landing place for Gatsby. But then it also allows you to see, how does Gatsby look at it? How does Daisy look at it? How does Tom look at it?
Right.
And it's fascinating to watch this symbol shift meaning and stuff.
But the funny thing about that example, and I think it really goes for a lot of symbols, is if you find yourself looking too hard for them, I think you're probably off base, because usually they're pretty obvious, and usually the author tells you. Like, I don't know that I can 100% generalize, but Gatsby's a great example of, there's multiple passages in that book where he's just like, it was the green light, and Gatsby must have poured all of his longing and all of his thoughts about the past into the green light. Is everyone paying attention to the green light and everything that I'm Fitzgerald?
First time I saw him,
green
he was
light
reaching out towards the green light.
Yeah, right.
When he finally held Daisy in his arms and went to the window and looked out, he was looking at the green light.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's other examples. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head, but
And so I guess what I would tell, and there are other things, if you're someone who reads, there are other categories. Just go through a book and think, okay, so what are the sort of things that I want to pay attention to?
Right.
Plot, setting. You can talk about setting. You can talk about all these things that are useful things to help you start to having something to say about the book. But a lot of times, this is the sort of thing you would teach high schoolers how to do with a book. And whether or not it's the most mature way to then talk about a book later in life is another question.
Well, the two questions that I think we ask on the bookening of every book, and we ask them in a million different ways, but I think whatever clothing we're putting on them, the basic bones are, what was the author intending here? We think about intentionality, like, why is it set here? Why is this character in here? Why is this? You can spend a whole podcast talking about why Shakespeare did something because it don't make no sense. And you're just like, well, I assume he did it for some reason. And I like to admit when those things don't make sense, because I think that makes for a more interesting, like, why did he do the fool? Like, let's not posit some theory of social whatever about it. Let's just bang our heads against, Shakespeare was a dude like you or me. He put this fool in and then he didn't pay it off. Is because he forgot, or because he just didn't need him any, So I think we ask of everything in a book, why is it there? And then we ask, what's the point? Which I think Adler tells you to ask, if I remember Jake's distillation of Adler from last week correctly. Just like, well, why should I care? Why? Okay, Jane Austen, you got a bunch of bumpkins from England bouncing off of each other relationally. Why? What does that mean to me? What, am I supposed to learn something? Am I supposed to laugh at something? Like, what did you hope would happen to me? And did it happen?
I think this is helpful because maybe it'll show people that we actually do have these things in our mind when we approach a book, but that maybe what they're getting for the bookening is more sophisticated than just a high school. Here's the symbol. Here's the character. Here's what this character does. Here's how they're a foil to this character.
I hope so, because you can go on SparkNotes and you can get that stuff.
Well,
I mean, honestly,
podcasts.
You have to read those things with discernment. But if you want to know what the theme of Gatsby is, you can type into Google, what is the theme of Gatsby?
And that's a great exercise, again, for high school, people learning how to tackle
Learning
literature.
how to read.
Yeah. And if you're at that place, so all this to say, it's not embarrassing if you're at that place. You never had a good English teacher who taught you that. These are things you can do, and there are great books. I'd be happy, anyone who wants to email us, I'd be happy to send you.
We don't have the patience or desire to be teaching a high school class, though.
So, but if you want that, if you realize you've never had that before, write us, and I have recommendations for books you can go and read. Yeah. They will give you all the categories you'll need. One great place and one book to buy would be How Fiction. One would be How Fiction Works, and then another would be Understanding Fiction.
Mm-hmm.
You can go and look those up. So,
but it's like learning grammar. It really is just it's storytelling grammar, and there comes a point where a student needs to stop thinking about grammar and they need to start thinking about writing. And that's what we attempt to do with literature. We may not always do it 100% successfully on the bookening, but we're not just going to lay out the grammar of who's the protagonist in this story and what is the rising action and
what are all the themes that you see?
What are the themes?
So
we're sort of assuming that you've already kind of thought that through when you join us. And we think it through depending on the complexity of the work, but we're generally assuming that stuff's either obvious or that you've already thought it through. And then the discussion starts with, okay, well, let's dig a little deeper and think, what did that actually matter and why? Yeah. Bookening Today was written and produced by Nathan Alberson, performed by Brandon Chasteen, Jacob Menzel, and Nathan Alberson, executive produced by Jacob Menzel, Nathan Alberson. You can go to patreon.com/thebookening and give us
Bookening.
That's how we became the Bookening. Switched songs on you there. Stole Brandon's song. I'm looking forward to listening to this intro that you guys recorded without me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
I'm sure it'll be very encouraging.
Yeah, you'll love it.
And I will feel very valued and loved.
Remember, I'm editing the episode.